Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled to have Dr. Hieu Phung of Rutgers University as a guest lecturer on our campus today to give a talk about the historical context of the book you all are reading, The Gangster We Are Looking For. We'd like to thank the Welcome Reads funder, the Kupferberg Holocaust Center. Thank you.
Dr. Phung is an assistant professor of Vietnamese and environmental history in the Department of Asian Languages and Culture. She is an environmental historian who investigates the impacts of local culture and statecraft on the pre-industrial environment, especially on water and climate. Born and raised in Vietnam, she has experiences as a former international student and as a migrant worker in the United States. Professor Phung teaches courses on environmental issues of Asia from the perspective of the humanities, as well as courses on the history of Vietnam.
So there will be time for Q&A at the end of Dr. Phung's lecture. And we're also going to put a QR code up at the end for you to do an attendance survey. Also, I'm going to put a copy of the book in the back for you all to sign. And then tomorrow when Tweed comes to campus, the author, she'll sign it. And that will be our gift to Dr. Phung for coming here from Rutgers. And so also please turn your phones off and put them away. We're going to be taking some pictures and it's getting recorded. And we want to thank everyone for attending, especially Dr. Phung for coming. And please join us in welcoming Dr. Hieu Phung to Queensborough Community College.
All right. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Professor Kunihan, Professor Schreinemakers, Professor Cinnamon, and all of you for welcoming me to QCC. Now, I have my lectures here, but I'm gonna start with as how I am in a classroom because actually this semester I'm on sabbatical working on my book. So I miss classroom. So you guys really give me an opportunity to see students again. It's really, really great. Today, I'm here to actually share with you some of my thoughts. It's quite personal thought about the book that I believe that you are reading in classroom, The Gangster We Are All Looking For by Lady Diễm Thúy. I would say that this is not an easy topic for me to say. And actually kind of off script right now a little bit because when I first came to the US 15 years ago, as a PhD student in history department, one of the things I told my advisors that you can test me anything about Vietnam, but not about the Vietnam War. I don't want to talk about the Vietnam War. Today would be the first time in 15 years I give a public talk on this topic. So I took it both as a feeling of I want to be here to learn from you. I share some of my thought, but I also want to hear your opinion, right? Your thought, your idea, your feeling. So today is not a lecture in a sense, but more a conversation. So I really looking forward for the Q&A session. So let me begin by saying that I'm an historian of Vietnam, and most of my work look at the Vietnamese people during the period up to 19th century. So particularly in their interactions with the environment, the landscape, the river, the mountain, the climate in a country that today we call Vietnam. So in a sense, the Vietnamese people I study are quite different from the Vietnamese people you encounter in the book, right? We often imagine Vietnam as one culture, one language, or one nation, right? But indeed, history shows it's way more complicated than that. Vietnam has always been layered with regional differences. And the well-known split between North and South during the Vietnam War was just one chapter in a much longer story of divisions and diversity. What has always amazed me is that every new thing I learn, I just realize how diverse Vietnamese culture, people, history truly are. There isn't just one Vietnam, and it's one message you want to take away from my lecture today is that there isn't just one Vietnam. If you look back through history, you can see two kind of forces at play. That this pull together the country together to create a sense of one unified Vietnam with one language, one culture. But at the same time, there's that kind of push of marking differences to say, here's one way of being Vietnamese and here's another. I've learned from one of Thuy's talk that what drove her to write wasn't that these things happened to her, but because that the refugee story, how to the struggles to leave, to resettle, to find a place, to find place in a new society, still happen today as we are speaking. As a writer, I believe that Thuy didn't engage with the Vietnam War in a usual political way, right? No, she does. She talk much about the escape journey per se. Instead, the war, the communist regime afterward, the struggle to find a place in the United States, all of that experiences, and even the very idea of Vietnam show up in her story, mostly through her character's search for understanding her own relationship with her parents. This approach matters for the couple reasons, and I gave you two. The first reason is that when many South Vietnamese resettled in the United States, the American story of the Vietnam War kept circling back to American itself. And in a way, South Vietnamese soldiers, people like the narrator's father, was pushed into the shadows. Of course, you can imagine in Vietnam, they were just forgotten. And for many in that first generation who came after 1975, the war wasn't something they might want to talk about either. I have had a lot of Vietnamese American students who just came to the class and told me, I kind of heard about this, but I don't really know what is about the war. My parents never want to tell me about this. And the second reason, Thuy's story puts back again conventional idea about family. If you talk with any Vietnamese at the very first thing, they're proud of talking about happy family. Happy family is kind of in the government's propaganda today, that everybody needs to have a happy family. When I was in grade school, my friends whose parents divorced, they can't say that because it's something kind of a shame. And even until very recently, I still don't know how the Vietnamese people describe a concept like broken family, dysfunctional family. Now we know that happened, but these concepts just don't translate into Vietnamese neatly. So in this way, right, Thuy's novel is also remarkable because it's one of the first works written by someone from what's called Generation 1.5. Anybody here know that concept? Raise a hand. Some, right? Some. Okay. So who are Generation 1.5? I actually first learned that concept not from Vietnamese sources, actually, but from reading about Asian Americans' experience. So Gen 1.5 refer to people who was born in Vietnam, but they left the country when they was very young. So you can understand that that means, right, they have some connection with the country, but most of their adult, right, experience, even their childhood, going to school, listen, most of that deep rooted in this country, in America, right? So Thuy represent that generation, right? The generation in between, the generation figuring out a new sense of being Vietnamese or being American or being some kind of thing that they are defined by themselves, right? And very, very important. You see the image of a boat here, and I'm gonna talk more about this in later of the lecture, is that many of them, including Thuy, right, came to the US and other communities in the diaspora through the journeys that we would refer to as the journeys of boat people. So for American readers, Thuy's story is a Vietnamese American story, right? But for Vietnamese readers, I believe that no matter where they live, no matter what kind of passport they hold, this story opened a conversation, a different kind of way to be Vietnamese. Now, Thuy write fiction. That's for sure. It's not a memoir, right? It's not even a history book. And I really appreciate Thuy's note at the very, very end of the book. I hope that you go all the way to the end of the book and see the note. There, she explains how her name carries the memory of her deceased sister who drowned in a refugee camp in Malaysia. That note also allows us to realize that when the narrator's brother dies in chapter 5, nước or water in Vietnam, the meanings of the term, we can see that death, right, less as a true to life story, but more symbolic moment woven into the story. And I'm gonna circle back to that detail at the end of my talk. Now, what I'm hoping to do today isn't to play the role of literary critic. That's really beyond my expertise. I want to give you a bit of historical background that connects to Thuy's story. And my goal is to offer another lens, not just for you to reflect on the story in Thuy's book, but also to think about a war that ends 50 years ago. Think about that. A half a century. Does it matter to us until today, right? So for some, that war unified Vietnam. For others, like the parents of Thuy's character, that war meant losing their homeland. And still, for others, it was just the war that ended in the victory of communism. So how we think about that war, right? And to understand why the family of Thuy's character fled Vietnam, we first need some basic context about the Vietnam War, or indeed actually a series of war conflicts that happened throughout the 20th century. So I believe that most of you here probably born in the kind of 2000 and something, right? So it's like you can say, oh, the war of the last century sounds very far, but is it really far, right? Now, the Vietnam War ended on April 30th, 1975. That day, the United States lifted its officers, Southeast Vietnamese allies and their family members out of Saigon, the old names of Ho Chi Minh City. The communist forces seized Saigon. South Vietnam's head of state, Dương Văn Minh, was forced into unconditional surrender. A little bit more than a year later, on July the 2nd, 1976, North and South Vietnam was formally merged into a new country referred to as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Today, most of people remember that day, April 31st, 1975, instead of remember the day that occurred 1 year later, which officially merged two parts of the country into one country. And this is just one example how public narratives often simplify the complexities of the past, right? And I want you to think that the Vietnam War isn't just about communism. Very, very important to really understand the war. Let's say let me just talk about my personal experience that I never really lived in any moment that close to war. So I always feel that I don't have enough power to talk about war in the true sense. But I remember when I was young, often placed on the top of a it is like a gate to go into a basement. I never know that until later that underneath it, it is a basement to hide from bomb. So it's just right in, like every kid just, and I grew up in the 1980s, which is 10 years after the war, but the war is still surrounding us. So, but still I feel like talking about the war is very different when we are so lucky to live in a time that we don't have to face the life and death at the moment. So let me keep you in mind, keep the note that the Vietnam War was a long, drawn-out war, a war of a whole generation. And what it means? It means like that. Like any protracted conflicts, it didn't affect everybody in the same way, right? Everybody have a different experience with the war. For example, depending on where they live. Sources told that, for example, people who live in Saigon experienced the war very different with someone living in countryside in South Vietnam, where one village would be under communist control in one day. And the next day they were saved by South Vietnamese army. That means even their family, toward the end of the war, they even created a strategy that if they have two sons, they send one son to work with the South Vietnamese government and one son work with the communist forces. Hopefully that if the war ends, they have someone in the family can protect them. So the war is not simply one side, here's our side and here's another side of the enemy. There are a lot of dynamic, there are a lot of changes, and I'm gonna demonstrate more as we go on with this lecture. And the second point I want you to remember about the war is that while the war officially ended in 1975, the tensions it left behind didn't just disappear. Actually, many issues I would say, still remain unresolved. And I personally don't really know how to face it, and we're still learning. We're still exploring. So 50 years it seems a long time, but it's not that far. Now, Thuy capture her main character's sense of Vietnam beautifully. She writes, Vietnam is a black and white photography of my parents sitting in bamboo chairs in their front courtyard. They are sitting tall and proud, surrounded by chickens and a rooster between their feet, and the doors of the courtyard are thin sandals. It is a timeless Vietnam. It is a glimpse into the past, a generational gap, a rural life that seems untouched by a protracted war conflict. For Thuy's character, I believe that Vietnam isn't just the photo, but actually it is her memory about the photo. The feeling is raw and real, yet understandably, distant from a Vietnam saved by countless wars in the 20th century, wars that were as much about global power structures as much as about Vietnam itself. That memory is also distant from the country of Vietnam. One has changed remarkably, for better or worse, since the end of the war, or a Vietnam that represents a language, a culture, or cultures, if we want to say it that way. Now, 50 years after the war ended, Vietnam is still under the same government that claimed victory. I didn't understand that significance, that impact, until I learned more about history of Southeast Asia. If you know a little bit about Philippines, about, say, Laos, Thailand, Indonesia, you know that coup is everywhere throughout those countries. And it's kind of puzzling how a communist regime maintained their power over the past 50 years. So it is puzzling. Now, I'm going to tell you how people in the country, particularly the government, going to tell you about this history, right? Now, in its official history, the so-called Vietnam War is framed as an anti-imperialist American war. Very goodly war, but you get it, right? Anti-imperialist American war. It's not a Vietnam War. Until before I left Vietnam, if you use the term Vietnam War translated into Vietnamese, you have trouble. You are not allowed to say even the name of the war inaccurately according to the official version. Now, that official history presented as a continuation of a longer anti-colonial fight against first French power. And in this narrative, the Vietnam War is not a separate event. It's just a part of a longer war. You see the point? It's a longer, broader anti-colonial struggle. For what? National independence. One that began in earlier 20th century, which is 1 century ago, okay? So because of that, in order to understand the Vietnam War, we need to go back a little bit in time. So it started in, the official accounts also affirm that, the Vietnam's nation wasn't founded in 1975, which we thought that, two countries unified, two part of the country unified in one government, under one government. But actually it claimed that that country already was declared in 1945 at the end of World War II. And that was just months after Japan had taken over Southeast Asia, including the part under French power, that's called Indochina. And before the Japanese troops surrendered to the Allied forces, a mix of British, American, Chinese, not communist Chinese, Chinese nationalists present in the region. So in Vietnam's official narrative, the end of this war wasn't about creating a new Vietnam, right? It just marked the reunification of two parts of the country to fulfill a mission left unfinished 30 years ago. So we have to understand how people living in Vietnam in 1945, 1950, 60, as they go through the Vietnam War, how they see the war, right? They don't really have our perspective to chop it up. Oh, this is Vietnam War, right? They see it as continual conflict, and all of that, what is for? To find a way to have an independent country. Now, historians have long shown how complex 1945 really was. That means there are many, many different powers try to do the same thing that the communists represented by probably a person you might heard of the name Ho Chi Minh, right? The ultimate leaders of the Vietnamese today, when they think about these conflicts. Now, when in 1945, when it is very little doubt that Ho Chi Minh was committed to communists at that time. But when he stood up, this person, this person under the umbrella behind the mic is Ho Chi Minh. He stood there. He declared that Vietnam now become an independent nation. When he did that, he didn't say a word about communism. Nothing about communism. He was talking about a republic for all different classes in the society. And because of that, he was known famously called the US and French Declarations of Independence. For what? To argue for the Vietnamese right for independence and self-determination. So it is important, and this is the point that you're not going to learn if you are in Vietnam. No country recognized this government. No, not even the Soviet Union. Who gonna recognize this government first? Guess. If it's not the Soviet Union, can you guess? Can you guess who actually recognized this government? Some country in the region. Loudly. China. And why? Because 1949, China, communist China, right, built new nation. It's right next door. China actually first recognized Ho Chi Minh's government, and soon the Soviet Union and the communist bloc actually recognized. So it takes time. So see, the point is that we often think about history as a moment, but things actually happen. And there are a lot of contingencies occur during this time, in between. Now, I want to circle back in the present time that just earlier this month, September, right? Vietnam staged a massive military parade in Hanoi. 16,000 soldiers marching on streets. Thousands of spectators lining the streets, including my sister's family, went to see it at 1:30 a.m. So lining up to see it. What's struggling me about this is that this was more than a ceremony to celebrate the nation's independence. That kind of sentimental was actually founded on a state-controlled historical narrative with a clear political purpose to glorify the leadership of the communism or communist leadership. In what? In the independent struggles and in post-war state building. The same narrative runs deep in historical textbook. So when you read historical textbook, you are intervened with an act of political activism, right? Whether or not you listen to this or you don't listen to this, it's actually really a political activism. And this shaped how people continue to remember an event that happened almost a century ago. So from another angle, though, this sentiment and so for me is that conflict like the Vietnam War is still very difficult topic to talk about. That war, why it meant different things to different people, but inside Vietnam, there's only one narrative, one history with a clear political mission that has been sanctified. I've tried to engage with the complexity of how the Vietnam War still called for multi-dimensional narratives and perspectives. So the rest of the talk gonna just focus on the Vietnam War itself and its aftermath, and I want to circle back to his story as well. Now, we pick up after World War II, right? Unfortunately, after Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of the nation, and it took a couple times, right? When China started to recognize it. In between that several years, you think several years is a lot. You are in college now, several years, you have a job, right? So in those several years, actually, the French found a way to reclaim the colony in Southeast Asia. So technically, Vietnam returned back into French colony. Three key three developments emerge. And I mention it because those are the moment or development that set the stage for the Vietnam War. That means the Vietnam War just didn't happen in 1950-60 when you started to think about it is the Vietnam War in American perspective. No, the Vietnam War, in that sense, actually already have some kind of origins from earlier time. The first is that Ho Chi Minh's force actually turned into guerrilla warfare because no country actually recognized them, right? Until after China recognized them, China started to influence the warfare tactics, and soon the communist forces under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh would adopt a strategy called the People's War. That means the war wasn't fought by professional troops, right? Everybody under the regimes was one of the soldiers. So it is the first. The second, probably familiar with you. 1947, President Truman, right, declared what now we know as Truman Doctrine, right, committing the United States to containing the spread of communism, right? So it is a global, international commission. But what is related to our story is that because of that, around 1950, so before the French stood there, at that time the French didn't have enough money to do anything in their colony, particularly in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. So it is the US actually divert some money to fund the French war in Indochina. So we have documented that, and in a way that some historians actually consider that moment as the first moment that US started to involve into the region's conflict. And the third point, right, the third development is very important, is that because of the pressures of the global at the time that started to see, colony is a bad thing, we need to act human, decolonization should be undergo, right? French under the pressure of returning Vietnamese independent. And what they did is that they actually established a Vietnamese non-communist government. Now, that government, basically a puppet government, but in principle, right, you have actually two groups of people try to build independent Vietnam, right? Ho Chi Minh's approach and another non-communist government. And by 1954, that government picked one special person. His name is Ngo Dinh Diep. He's a Catholic. He haven't been travel around. He just returned from the US. And when he was in the US, he have a very good connection, particularly with one of the person you might know, JFK. So he returned to Vietnam and he served as prime minister of this regime. And it gave him a political platform to build what we're gonna know the South Vietnamese government during the Vietnam War. So you already see that there are two Vietnams there, right? And then you see that the international influence from French and then the United States. So it is how the turning point here is that 1954 was a critical time because it's a time that the communist regime Ho Chi Minh's force was able to win a very important battle called Dien Bien Phu. It's a really, really long story, but just keep in mind that there was huge victory for the communist force or for Ho Chi Minh's force. Ngo Dinh Diep started to consolidate his power, and then eventually French was forced to sign something called Geneva Accords. Now, what is this about this accord? It happened in Geneva, and it used the 17 parallel. You can see that a little bit dot here. The 17 parallels as a division line. And people in the country would have a 300 days to regroup. Okay, if you are sympathizers of communists, move north. If you don't want to stay with the communists, move south. Can you imagine how chaotic it is? 300 days for people to make the decision. right? So if you're talking about at the end of the Vietnam War, there are a lot of escape refugee experience. It didn't start there. It already happened way before that. Now, a piece of that, of course, is that 2 years after this regrouping, one general election gonna be held, and the Vietnamese people gonna decide what kind of government they want. You might know that because that election never happened. Now, Washington never agreed with the Geneva settlement. It's one thing. The government by Ngô Đình Diệm even wasn't included in the talk. So basically, you have like people who were already involved into the conflict, totally was put outside of this very important pieces of settlement. And this led us to the war, right? Now, if we connect this moment with Thu's story, I want to point out that, do you remember that the character's father, right, came from the north, right? And he ran south. I believe that there's some historical fact in that movement. But even if it's not, it would reminding that a lot of South Vietnamese who fled the country in 1975, they was originally from the north. So between 1954 and 1975, which is kind of parallel with what we would say the Vietnam War, this war unfolded in 3 phases, saved by 2, but not by 2, but 4. But 4 major forces: North Vietnam, Viet Cong, which is the communist force in the south, and I'm gonna explain a little bit more. But keep in mind that there are communist forces in the south that are separate from the communist force in North Vietnam. Okay, the U.S.-backed government, South Vietnamese government for sure, and the U.S. itself. Each, power player intervene into the conflict at different phase with different roles. Keep in mind that they don't, fight each other at the same time. The role involved over the time. So I'm gonna just summarize very, very, very briefly for you what happened. So we can think about this war into 3 phases. Earlier, up to early 1960s, what happened? In the north, at that time, Ho Chi Minh and his, cabinets really focused on, let's focus on the north. We want to build a socialist society, right? We're not going to engage with war in the south. It's very important in that time. And that point actually later on gonna create a split within the communist force itself. Because do you want to just focus on building a socialist society in the north, or you also want to unify the country, or you want to also fight in the south? So it is actually the questions before 1960. It's still, put on the table. Now, of course, Ngô Đình Diệm now consolidated powers, and clearly with U.S. backing, the communist forces in the south. Who are they? Why are they? So what happened is that when people was ordered to regroup in 1954, are you following me, right? So some of the communist forces was ordered to stay behind. They are not allowed to fight anything, but they stay behind. And in a way that they kind of act as a civilian. So you have in the south a South Vietnamese government backed by the U.S., but here in the countryside, you still have those people that later known as VC or Viet Cong. And very interesting is that in the south, because it's modeled after the democratic society in the U.S., right? So you actually have a multiple opinion in the society. You're not necessarily agree with the government, but you also don't want to become communist either. And they form third forces. And by the 1960s, the third force on the tension between the VC that asked the North, we want to fight. Why you just care about the North, right? All of that tension, right, built up. And 1963, what happened? 1963, in Saigon, Ngô Đình Diệm was killed in a coup. And quite clearly, that coup was signaled by Washington. 20 days after that, what happened in Dallas? JFK was shot. The President of the United States was shot. The country that backed the Southern regime was shot. You can imagine that is such a chaotic month, right? What are we gonna do? And so in that context, right, the North Vietnam, now under a hardline leadership, they decided, no, we're gonna fight. We're gonna open mass compassion in the South. So they support the VC in the South to form the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam. A junta government took powers in the South, and also very interesting that a couple months after the assassination, both in Saigon and in the United States, there was something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And that incident was basically US Navy in the Gulf of Tonkin in the north was reported to be attacked by North Vietnamese army. It is a pretext. It is something. The North Vietnamese became aggressive, right, for the United States. They attacked our Navy. We can't sit here anymore. And it's a time that both North Vietnamese government and the United States began to send massive troops and supplies to South Vietnam. We are now really, really in the war. That war lasts until 1973. There are a lot of details there, a lot of battle. I'm not going into detail. But what you know is that 1973, the United States agreed to sign something called Paris Peace Agreement that basically ends U.S. involvement. So some historians call it, okay, the American war is over. But the Vietnam War wasn't over. Because the war, now U.S. troops was withdrawn immediately after that agreement, but the war continues under Vietnamization. That means Vietnamese fought Vietnamese during that time. 1975, Saigon fall, right? Now, the fear of communists was very real in South Vietnamese. You can imagine that if you work for one regime, that regime collapsed. Of course, everybody fear they're gonna be killed or they're gonna be punished, right? That is human instincts, right? And this was, after all, a long, intense, and deadly war. Both sides rely heavily on propaganda. Now, there are a lot of good research now on the propaganda, doing for sure by North Vietnamese, but also by the US and South Vietnamese as well. So people, in a time that they don't really know their enemy, a lot of illusion, a lot of fear also intensified by that. For those who couldn't escape in 1975, like Thuy's parents, right? Thuy character's parents, many with ties to the old government were sent to something called re-education camps. I want to note here that this topic is very, very difficult to study. Until today, the Vietnamese government has not released any records. This is not something that you can talk freely in Vietnam. And most of what we know actually based on the memoirs of those who survived those camps, prisoners, whatever you want to call. So I leave it there. Now, after 1975, there's some kind of movement that the Vietnamese call it vượt biên. That means crossing the border. And that became a wound for me that never really healed in unified Vietnam. Perhaps every Vietnamese knows someone who fled Vietnam by boat. I remember when I was very young, in grade school, living in Hanoi, far away from the areas in the South where most of people try to live. I knew that term. And I knew that it is terrible, it's bad. But there's something that you never gonna try to ask your professor, Professor, what is it about this history? You just know that it is a topic you shouldn't ask. You heard about that, but you just don't ask, okay? These people later on would be known as the boat people. Oh, I'm gonna finish very soon. Give me like 2 more minutes. How many people already fled the country by this route? The estimation is that between 1975 to early 1990s, about 2 million people fled on that route. And the most common routes cross the South China Sea to countries like Indonesia, Malaysia. Here, I'm gonna show you. You see, this is a piece of art, actually, and I love it so much because it is art. It's more kind of feeling. But it gives you a sense that those red routes depict how people use boat to fled out of Vietnam. To down here, let me see here. It's Malaysia here, Indonesia down here. The Philippines is another. Thailand here. Hong Kong route here is also very important stop. And it's actually create something called international refugee crisis. So it is another long topic, but I'm gonna just very summarize to use that. Most of those people who reach those refugee camps, they stay there. Some people lucky, some months, some year, longer, until they get some sort of paperwork to be adopted by another country, mostly the United States, Canada, Australia. Some would be returned to Vietnam. Many people who actually went on that strategy, that journey, endure not just hardship, but also there are a lot of things that because we still do not know the official account about that, so we don't really know how many people actually die, right? Every number is just estimation. So I'd like now to close my talk by circling to Thuy's novel, especially her use of the theme of nước or water. Thuy explained that the word for water in Vietnamese means both water and nation, country, or homeland. It seems a very common knowledge among Vietnamese, both inside the country and outside in the diaspora. The novel's last travel moved back and forth between California and Vietnam, tied together through the death of the narrator's brother, who remained in Vietnam, and a phone call, likely from the narrator's grandfather, who had a strained relationship with the narrator's father. Now, I want to point out here is that in the context of both people history, nước often carry the trauma of escape. You see here is a presentation of how many people squeeze in a boat as in their journey. So for those who live in the coast like a Thuy's character's family, water could also mean home. In Thuy's story, nước seems to be deeply personal. It is the bad water that took life of the narrator's brother, yet it also what kept him, the last connection with the main character, right, in Vietnam. So by tying nước or water to such a private experience, I believe that Thuy was revealing to us there's no single way to understand or to feel Vietnam. So I stop here. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward.
So we have some questions. If anyone has some questions.
So I have family that are Chinese, and they tend to talk to me about symbolism for things. So when I read the book, and there was a mention of a white ceiling in Asian culture, white from my hair means death or like dying. So are there any like similarities that you would know of yourself?
Now, if I get it correctly, the detail about oh.
We
I
have to
can-
press it. Sorry.
Okay. So you are. Does it? Does it go? So you are talking about the whistling as the characters kind of lay down and look into and play, right? For me, actually, these details more like the imagination of a kid. I don't think it is come directly from any culture for me. But you, as a reader, right, you totally entitled to interpret it that way. Now, white represent death. Yes or no? In Vietnam, it is the color of funeral. However, I would be a little bit careful to connect it with particular case. Probably we need to know more about, or actually leave it open to understand that. Yeah. This is my interpretation.
But I was asking, like, is there any other like similarities other than white, like maybe that you would know of, like maybe from Vietnam, there are maybe colors, maybe animal that have other meanings rather than what they are.
Of course, I believe that all of the cultures should have a lot. Depends on the context. I think one of the things I want to use that to elaborate on, particularly the detail about the death of the brother in the story, because I personally, when I read this, I really tried to imagine where that family was in Vietnam. Which part of the country? Is it in the countryside, in the city, in the central Vietnam, in the south? And I couldn't locate it. The practice of how dealing with the dead people. So it's a very, very personal. It's very local, right? So again, we talk about Vietnam, but there's so many local differences in the country. Yeah. Other questions? Feel free to ask me anything, not just about the book, but also about, the what you learned today. Come on, you are here. Listen to me for 30 minutes, and you don't let me listen anything. I envy you. Go ahead. Yes.
Wait, hold on. I saw the picture of the Tet that was called the Lunar New Year.
Yes.
How's it celebrate? How do the Vietnamese celebrate the Lunar New Year?
So I would say I don't know, like when I did the lectures, it go very it matched with my talk, but this picture is like idealized, right? Idealized sense of Tet, right? Now again, just like in the United States, you're gonna see people celebrate Christmas in this area, in Hawaii very differently, and in
Really?
Vietnam too.
I didn't know that.
Oh no, it is. You're gonna see like so the thing is, generally the idea of Tet or the New Year is for family. And for remembering ancestors is very important.
Oh, okay.
Remembering ancestors. Yeah.
All right.
And but in terms of the food, in terms of the what exactly people do, it varies from one reason to another reason. I can see that it varies from people in the country and people in the diaspora. And I want to say that younger people like you now, they want to do different things in the new year, and that's serious debate. Like, should we stay at home and visit like our relative, or should we go travel? So Vietnam is changing. Vietnam is changing.
I get it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Is this working? Hi. So the part about the line between North and South and people being forced to move reminded me of how in India and Bangladesh and Pakistan, under similar colonial rule, there were people that were made to migrate long distances, give up everything, and, you know, basically uproot their life. And I'm kind of wondering if those two are like the same kind of practice. It seems like a little common to like make colonial people like move long distances and like relocate them.
Thank you for the question. So, one of the things I want to say that 1954, with the agreement, the international agreement of asking people to move. First of all, in theory, right, it's not a force. People can choose, right? But indeed, if your father decided to move, right? The whole family gonna move. And it's very often in the case in Vietnam at that moment, if one, normally they move the entire village. For example, if that village follow Catholicism, the whole village follow because, not necessarily because they know anything about democracy or communism, but because their father, their priest told them to go, and they would go. And sure, it is a very hard decision, but it is another issue when we think about migration that, for me, it's not, it can be a choice, but most of the time it's not really a choice. So even with a lot of people who later on, become refugee in after 1975, and I, based on my limited reading, some people actually, they're not really because of they can't live in Vietnam, but because all of their relative clan already moved out. Then they decided to go because it is the choice, right? So again, I don't have enough knowledge to make that compare or enough time, but I do think that when we're thinking about migration, about even refugee in this case, it's really, really, we have to put them in the like put our mind in their shoes, and it's really not about choices, right? Even though it is their choices there, right? Yeah, thank you.
Just one more question, and can we get oh, sorry. Students, make sure you do the scan the QR code for your attendance, and those of you as you leave, if you don't mind signing the book that Hieu will take home with her.
Any other questions?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, come for another question or two. Everybody sit.
Oh, the girl first, and then you. Okay. Go. I take more questions and answer. Go ahead.
I really related to that 1.5 generation thing because I'm not Southeast Asian, I'm South Asian, but I immigrated from my country from persecution and stuff when I was really young, and I always felt like I'm connected to my country, but I was raised in America, and I never heard of that term before, so I'm really
Thank you. You should look for some material reading about that. It varies from one community to another, like Asian or basically, a community to another. But I think it is really very interesting to reflect on our own experience, right? Yeah. Thank you for the comment. Yes.
I just want to say that I feel like Vietnam was more connected to the United States than China or the Soviet Union, as you said. What's your opinion on that?
So we go back with the message that I try to say, right? There isn't just one Vietnam, right? So there one Vietnam you might know, and you see that it's really connected to the United States. But there another Vietnam, Vietnam has been next to China for a long time. That's most of my study dealing with, how Vietnam and Chinese interact for 1,000 years. So Vietnam also very connected to China. Now Russia also intervened in Vietnam, particularly North Vietnam, for several decades. And during the time that we call Cold War, right, only communist countries stick together. Most of education, everything Vietnam actually get influence from Russia. So are you talking about today's Vietnam or or general?
There was times before that Vietnam interacted with the United States before China because they got their supplies from.
Oh, no, but it is just money. The U.S. wasn't present in the country, right? So you are talking about before 1960, right? Is it that point, right? Yes, yes. So at that time, the U.S. didn't connect with Vietnam. The U.S. connect with France. France connect with the U.S. And it is an indirect intervention. That makes sense? It is later, after that, right? Only during the war, right? Then the U.S. have a initiative to intervene in South Vietnam. And yes, during that time, right, Vietnam and the U.S. are also connected. Now, if we move it to today, right, the U.S. and Vietnam is also very connected in many ways. For example, many students come here to study, right? Many business men actually present in American business actually present in Vietnam as well. That makes sense?
Well, there's also the time when Vietnam also got their Declaration of Independence.
Oh, how about like that? Because everybody are waiting. So let me talk with you after we wrap up. Right? I happy to talk with you once we wrap up the talking. Oh, one more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Hi,
Quick,
thanks for coming.
Quick one.
So, you know the part where you said the 1.5 gen? Were those most likely kids of different tribes where they would probably try to join forces with other people because the boat showed a whole bunch of kids? I'm not sure if that's one village or one part of Vietnam, or sometimes they probably mix them to kind of limit the amount of problems they have with another part of Vietnam.
You mean those people who left, right?
Who migrated here.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I couldn't get the point, like how it connect with your questions related to Gen 1.5.
All right, so I know that the people who came here on the boat are called the Gen 1.5 because they have it.
Their parents would be Gen 1. And
But
their
the kids would be Gen 1.5 because
correct.
they moved here, right?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm trying to ask if that was a way to unify a part of Vietnam with other people because they had kids that came here, or they came here from before, trying to unify the kids from different parts of Vietnam to kind of settle a problem that they have ongoing.
That's an ideal. I see Vietnamese in my cohort, like living in the US as a Gen 1.5. They try to, through their study, to interact with people inside Vietnam to find a way to reconcile this war, right? It's ideal. But I would say it's very difficult. It's a very hard because, one, you have to figure out how to talk with your own parents, right? This is something. It's painful experience. Not everybody want to say, and not everybody have the same experience to say it's a one thing right to talk about that. And you have to really understand the politics of today's Vietnam. And it is another thing. And I demonstrate in my lectures that there only one version of history in Vietnam you can talk about. So I think it's ideal, but I personally do not know how we can really turn it into a kind of dominant movement. But right now, I think there is effort. And I totally agree with you. It is a very good way to connect. Right now, I would say, most of the best films that made in Vietnam actually made by Gen 1.5. They came back in Vietnam and make film about Vietnam. Some of the film would be welcome. Some of the film was censored. Never going to be done, sold in Vietnam. So there's effort there. And I believe that Vietnam is changing. I just do not know how people's perception about history is going to change. And we need that.
Is that because most people feel a different type of hurt depending on where they were inside of the Vietnam War?
Yes. If I wasn't trying to go to the U.S. and I don't think I can do this talk. I would not have that perspective. It took me a very long time, very emotional journey. When I was first year here, I don't have a problem about it, cultural shock, I don't have that problem. I have problem that American professor told me that everything you know about Vietnam was wrong. And it took a long time to learn, to study,
So that's
And-
like coming from somewhere that somebody that's not from there teaching you about it.
Yeah. It can happen, right? Yeah. Thank you. And I want to say the last word for all of those who asked a question. I'm sorry I couldn't ask your name, but I really appreciate it. And thank everybody for being here and listen and pay attention to the talk. Thank you so much.